The first discussion topic on today's Peace and Prosperity is Pyongyang and Washington's decision to resume their nuclear negotiations amid a formal impeachment inquiry into U.S. President Donald Trump. In a rare move, North Korea made the announcement first, and the U.S. State Department later confirmed the North's statement. However, a day after the announcement, North Korea fired a projectile presumed to be a submarine-launched ballistic missile. North Korea has been pressing the U.S. to make a bold decision and come up with a new proposal. What's Pyongyang's strategy for future nuclear talks with the U.S.? And how will Trump's impeachment inquiry over the Ukraine scandal affect the dialogue? The second discussion topic on today's Peace and Prosperity is the intention behind Pyongyang and Beijing seeking increasingly closer ties out of North Korea-U.S. dialogue. Following his visit to Pyongyang last month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called for dialogue between North Korea and the U.S. and urged the UN Security Council to consider rolling back North Korea-related resolutions in a speech at the UN General Assembly.
安理会有必要结合半岛局势进展，考虑启动涉朝决议的可逆条款，为政治解决半岛问题注入动力。
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un sent a congratulatory message to Chinese President Xi Jinping on October 1st to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Communist China's founding, saying, North Korea will always stand by China. Why are North Korea and China stressing their decades-long friendship ahead of North Korea-U.S. talks? Could China's domestic and foreign policy woes have played a role, including its trade war with the U.S. and pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong? To shed light on these latest developments, our host, Pyeongyang Sik, research fellow at Yonsei University's Institute for North Korean Studies, is joined by Woo Jung-yeon, director at the Center for American Studies at the Sejong Institute. To broaden our perspective, we also connect with guest experts on Skype, including Roat Manning, senior analyst at the U.S. think tank Atlantic Council, and Tong Zhao, senior fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy.
North Korea and the U.S. appear to resume their nuclear negotiations on October 5th. The news comes as Washington and Beijing are facing major domestic and foreign policy woes, including the launch of an impeachment inquiry into U.S. President Donald Trump, the ongoing trade war between China and the United States, and pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. How will the U.S. and China play the North Korea card to tackle these issues? Joining with us today to help break down all these important issues is Dr. Woo Jung-yeon, director at the Center for American Studies at the Sejong Institute. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We are informed that the United States and North Korea are finally getting the working level negotiations to start, at least according to the North Korean government's statement. How do you see the prospect of the working level negotiations to be successful this time?
So I think it's a good thing that North Korea finally announced that they are ready to have a talk with the United States in early October. But the things that concerns observers was that North Korea has kept reiterating that unless United States has changed its position toward the working level negotiations, it's going to be a failure for the negotiation between North Korea and the United States. That means that after Hanoi, that North Korea has not shown any indication that North Korea has changed its strategic shift, but they keep arguing that it is United States that has to take all the responsibility of a failure. So we don't know yet how this is going to evolve, but if North Korea keeps this position that U.S. has to change its position first, then I think the prospect is not that bright.
Well, North Korea just test-fired another short-range missile on the 2nd of October. And Blue House, the executive office of the South Korean government, unlike its previous very cautious attitude, made an announcement that it is likely to be a SLBM, test firing, submarine-launched ballistic missile. So what do you see the reasons for North Korea launching another short-range missile at this point?
I think three hypotheses can be possible, and maybe all of them are the element of the North Korea's decision-making process. So one is that North Korea wants to make it just granted that North Korea has this right to test their own missiles unless it's over the mid-range or intercontinental range. And second, North Korea wants to have more assets before the negotiations, so they can discard a couple things before they actually have to give up their nuclear weapons. And third one is that they want to show their capabilities and provoke the United States and let U.S. call off the meeting so they can blame the United States for not having the meeting. So we don't know yet, but since our Blue House mentioned that there's a possibility of SLBM this time, that it's one of the things that U.S. really worries because it's a strategic asset. So I think that the North Korea, by testing the SLBM, that to show United States that they have this capability. So it's not really denuclearization of the North Korea, but maybe arms control or arms reduction between two countries.
My next question is the timelines that might be quite different between North Korea and the United States. It is no secret that U.S. President Donald Trump needs to get re-elected by winning the presidential election next November 2020. At the same time, Chairman Kim Jong-un, in the Supreme People's Assembly meeting held in April this year, made a statement that North Korea would only wait until the end of this year, 2019. Is there any way Washington and Pyongyang can, keep their different timelines in harmony?
The only reason that I was not really optimistic about the prospect of the working level negotiations this time was that the two working level negotiations in the past between two countries was just before the summit between two leaders. Okay. So all the working level negotiations were the actually preparation for the summit, but this time there is no promise of having summit between two countries, and I don't know what kind of things the North Korean delegates can have mandates to negotiate with their United States counterpart. So that is why that U.S. I believe that North Korea has been very hesitant to have a working level negotiations without having promise by the United States to have a summit. So I think that North Korea's strategy is very clear that they don't believe that they would have make much more progress in working level negotiations. Rather, they want to have a summit between Trump and Kim. So I think that North Korea, because Chairman Kim already promised to President Trump, they have to have working level negotiations. Right. But the only reason that they have working level negotiation is to have a summit between Trump and Kim.
I see. We now turn to an expert in the United States, Mr. Roat Manning, a senior analyst at the U.S.-based think tank, Atlantic Council. Welcome to our program, Mr. Manning.
Oh, I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Right, good to have you. North Korea and the U.S. have agreed to hold working-level talks, at least according to the North Korean government's announcement. Do you think the U.S. came up with a new proposal or new method that is good enough to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table?
Well, I'm not sure anything's good enough to satisfy Kim Jong-un. That would be in the interests of the United States. But to craft a different approach that's more flexible, and I think that's one of the reasons we're finally getting these working level talks moving. And I think what he'd like to do is, I think what they're going to start with is what was left on the table after the last summit, which was the offer about destroying facilities at Yongbyon, and then build on that, because it was a flawed proposal, because number one, they didn't agree to destroy all the facilities at Yongbyon. Number two, they didn't agree to have the IAEA verify and monitor it. And if you don't do that, it's not credible. And they wanted a complete end to sanctions. I don't think that's possible. I do think what is possible is that the U.S. may want to go back to the UN Security Council and get a new resolution that would allow them to lift some of the sanctions in proportion to progress in denuclearization, and then have a snapback provision, so if the North Koreans cheat or don't do it, maximum pressure comes back. Because the problem for the U.S. is they're afraid that once they ease sanctions, it's a slippery slope, and that'll be the end of it. So if you have that kind of provision, and I think the Chinese and others would agree to that, then I think it allows the U.S. a lot more flexibility in the negotiations, and a lot enabling them to meet more of North Korea's demand.
I see. Let's talk about domestic politics in the United States. The impeachment inquiry into U.S. President Donald Trump. Do you think President Trump may be tempted to use a North Korea card to try to get out of this political predicament?
I don't think North Korea is going to get him out of this predicament. I think you've seen the whistleblowers report. It's clearly an abuse of power and possibly a violation of the law, and we'll see what the investigation leads to. But no matter what he does on North Korea, I don't think it's going to impact that. North Korea may impact his calculation on policy if he feels he's being under siege. If he can come up with a major foreign policy success, he may be motivated to maybe do more than he might have otherwise. That's certainly possible.
Is North Korea remain high on the list of very urgent top foreign policy priorities for Trump administration? Because United States is also dealing with a lot of other foreign policy challenges with Iran, China.
Well, Trump has a problem because on all these issues, I think he's being perceived as a paper tiger. And, he threatened Iran, doesn't do anything. He threatened North Korea, doesn't do anything. He's threatened Venezuela, and doesn't do anything, and so on. So I think that in terms of North Korea, he has a big personal investment. If you recall, he's made a big point of saying everybody else has failed. I alone can fix this. And he has and with all these summits and his personal relationship and all his beautiful letters from Kim Jong-un, he's got a very big personal relationship in this. So I think that's going to be a factor in influencing what decisions he makes. I think the big question is how much, Trump has done everything himself, and Kim has played on that to basically sidestep our whole foreign policy bureaucracy. And so the question now is, will Trump let Steve Bannon do his job and negotiate the next step in denuclearization? And I think Trump has already talked about another summit, but if you saw his last statements, he implied that there needs to be some progress. I think he was referring to these working level talks. So I think that will, and we'll see what happens. But I think Steve Bannon is a very careful and smart guy, and he understands North Korea's interests, and will try to find a balance of interests for the U.S. and North Korea that we can move forward with.
Right. There was Mr. Roat Manning at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining our program.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Dr. I'd like to turn to the second question that we discussed with Mr. Manning, the impact of impeachment inquiry onto U.S. President Donald Trump. It might affect the U.S. policy toward North Korea. Mr. Manning said that there's no connection, but what's your opinion on this?
I think Bobby is correct, and many observers in Washington, D.C. Believed in the same way that President Trump's interest in North Korea has already faded because there is not much progress that he can make with North Korea. And if this impeachment process is really ongoing in the coming couple months, then President Trump, if he cannot deliver any major victory vis-a-vis North Korea, then there's no reason for him to focus on North Korean issues. On the contrary, that there's also some like minor view that because President Trump was like cornered by this like domestic politics, he might use this foreign policy card, and which is North Korean negotiations, to divert public attention from like domestic political issues. But we don't know yet whether North Korea can give President Trump a big enough deal so he can divert domestic politics of the United States from the impeachment issues.
The North Korean ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Sung Kim, mentioned that the United States would better come up with a bold decision, echoing Chairman Kim Jong-un's reference to United States with a new idea or courageous action. What do they actually mean? What would constitute the bold decision by the United States that would satisfy North Koreans?
So after Hanoi, the North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Hong-ho mentioned that United States has very different or incorrect like calculations when it comes to their negotiation between North Korea and the United States. So I think that the North Korea's position is clear that what they propose in Hanoi should be accepted by the United States.
You mean the lifting of 5 major United Nations Security Council resolutions?
In exchange for the Yongbyon
Yongbyon.
facilities. And the problem is that United States believe that sanction is the only key to lead ultimate denuclearization of North Korea. So they don't want to lift the sanctions, but North Korea wanted to lift all major sanctions in exchange for Yongbyon facility, which they don't really clarify what that means.
Okay. North Korea have turned to China ahead of scheduled negotiations or summits with the United States. A key Chinese official would visit Pyongyang, followed by Kim Jong-un's trip to China. Here's a short clip to refresh your memory.
The increasingly close ties between North Korea and China are in the spotlight. As history shows, a senior Chinese official's visit to North Korea, followed by Kim's trip to China, often leads to talks between North Korea and the U.S. A few days after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi traveled to Pyongyang to sit down with his North Korean counterpart in May 2018, Kim visited China twice in the span of 2 months. Kim's visits to China had a direct impact on North Korea's working-level talks with the U.S. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's first trip to Pyongyang came days after Kim's first unofficial visit to China in March 2018. Pompeo's second trip to Pyongyang took place after Kim's second visit to China in May the same year, which was followed by the first historic Kim-Trump summit a month later. Pompeo's third trip to Pyongyang came immediately after Kim's third visit to China in June 2018. The second Kim-Trump summit was held in February this year, following Kim's fourth visit to China. From Wang Yi's visit to North Korea to Kim's trip to China, North Korea has established a pattern of forging closer ties with China before reaching out to the U.S. for dialogue.
Dr. Wu, I'd like to ask you a question about Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's remark at the United Nations General Assembly. He urges the members of the United Nations Security Council only if there is a substantial progress by North Korea for denuclearization, then United Nations Security Council may have to consider to be more flexible about existing United Nations Security Council resolutions upon North Korea, economic sanctions. And he also emphasized that the need to bolster the political settlement of the peninsular issue. What do you make of Minister Wang Yi's remark?
I think he reiterated China's principled position on the Korean Peninsula. So first one, it might be related to the sanctions, and if there's a progress in negotiating between DPRK and the United States, UN Security Council has to consider that how to modify the resolutions that UNSC has made so far. And second, for the settlement on the Korean Peninsula issue is about how North Korea and the United States make like peace accord between two countries, and how China and other like neighboring countries should involve. So I think it is like principled approach by China on the Korean Peninsula. But China wants to tell North Korea that if North Korea indeed makes progress, then China is going to lead in the discussion of the UNSC so they can lift the sanctions with other countries like Russia and other countries.
I see. Now we'll hear observations from China. We have a line Dr. Tong Zhao, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Hello, Dr. Zhao.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Dr. Tong Zhao, what does the North Korean nuclear issue mean for China? Because China must have a lot of challenges in a political and diplomatic sense.
I think North Korea's nuclear weapons are a big headache for China. China would always worry that if one day its relationship with North Korea went bad, all the North Koreans' nuclear weapons and missiles could become a security threat to China as well. And also, as long as DPRK maintains its nuclear weapons, China feels that would provide an excuse for other countries, including the United States and Japan and South Korea, to deploy more advanced military assets in this region and to further strengthen their military alliance relationship. And China worried that a stronger American-led security alliance and all the advanced military assets could be a threat to China as well. So there is clear common interest, and China certainly wants to help denuclearize DPRK. But China also feels that the most effective way to disarm DPRK is to help DPRK feel safe enough so that it can reduce its reliance on nuclear weapons. So China has a different approach about how to denuclearize DPRK.
Well, the last point you mentioned, the need to make sure that North Korea feels safe, was mentioned by your Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the United Nations General Assembly, call for conditional rollback for North Korea. But would it be risky for Xi Jinping government to take as a policy when there's ongoing trade friction with the United States?
I don't think China wants to be seen as siding completely with DPRK against the United States. I think China wants to help mediating the denuclearization negotiations. Previously, prior to the G20 summit, Chinese President Xi visited Pyongyang, and some people believe China made an effort trying to persuade Kim Jong-un to be more flexible and to be more accommodating in its future negotiations with the United States. So China tried to help, but on the other hand, another major geopolitical development on the horizon is this growing US-China bilateral competition and rivalry. As a result, some Chinese strategists start to believe that if a nuclear-armed North Korea can make trouble for the United States, that would help distract the United States and help divert the Americans' attention away from China. So that would be useful for defending China's own interests and help China gain a benefit, an advantage in the US-China bilateral competition.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Zhao.
Thank you.
Right, Dr. Wu, anything particular from the remarks by Dr. Zhao?
I think his comment shows the kind of like dilemma that China has now with regard to North Korea. That there's a debate in China whether North Korea is a strategic asset or a strategic burden to China when China rather enjoys good relations with the United States. Because with the good relations with the United States, that China, how to deal with North Korea is a great question for China. But when the strategic competition between the US and China intensified, China had no choice but to get along with North Korea. So I think that they still have the dilemma, but now the external environment led China to have more closer relations with North Korea.
Okay, let's put your remark in more specific terms, looking to the future. Let's assume that the working level negotiation between North Korea and the United States will get going well, intensifying. Then what kind of role do you expect China wants to play or can play? Because we are also talking about North Korea and the United States might be opening liaison offices or trying to replace the armistice agreement with something else, like a peace declaration.
So I think that in economic arena, that China wants to make sure that North Korea gets enough support from the international community, including the United States. And that also includes the lift of sanctions in very earlier stage of the negotiations. And second, for the negotiation for the peace accord between the United States and North Korea, that is, I think, more important for China because it's going to determine what kind of the geostrategic situation that is in Northeast Asia, which has huge impact on China. So I think China's keen interest is in the peace negotiations rather than the lift of sanctions for North Korea.
Right, Dr. Woo, Director of the Center for American Studies at the Sejong Institute. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you today. Be sure to check into Peace and Prosperity next week to see how North Korea and the United States will find a middle ground in upcoming working level talks. Thanks for watching.